It's a pleasure to be joined by Professor Danny Dorling again this week. We had him on the show in July for Slowdown, and now we're talking about Finntopia, what we can learn from the world's happiest country. So like Rule Britannia, which you did with Sally Tomlinson, this is a co-authored book. Can you tell us about how it came about?
Yes. What happened was I went to do a talk in Cambridge about inequality, and Annika was there. She was helping the group who were arranging that, and I was showing examples of inequality in different countries, and Finland keeps on coming up as doing very well. And it was quite funny because she was from Finland, so it wasn't a surprise to her at all. She wanted a summer internship job, which we did. She was based in Cambridge when she did that, and spent 6 weeks looking at comparing England and Finland. Every statistic we could get, which was comparable between England and Finland, and we did that, and it was fairly devastating because Finland just does so much better on everything. Actually, I can't remember anything where England did better. And we thought, well, let's turn it into a book or a report or something. Sent it off to a publisher, and the publisher said, "Oh, that's very interesting, but take out the England bit. We don't want to know about England. Just write about Finland." So then we spent 2 years doing a book. It takes longer than you think, and the result is Finntopia. And we did try also to say what's going wrong in Finland, because it's relatively easy to say how well Finland does. It's harder to look at what isn't working and try to work out why some things aren't working.
And you say this in the introduction of the book that you didn't want to refer to the COVID pandemic because it was too early to say. But with more time passing, how do you think the country's dealt with the pandemic, and how does it compare to Britain as well?
Okay, I mean, dealing with pandemics is partly a matter of luck. So if by really unusually bad luck, given where, if some Chinese business people had arrived at the end of December in Finland, we would be calling this the Helsinki pandemic of Europe. But of course, that was unlikely anyway. Finland's record looks incredibly good. And so I'm sort of stumbling here over it is partly remoteness that has helped, but also the Finns have been stockpiling PPE, personal protective equipment, since the 1957 flu pandemic. Right? And just in general, people in more equitable countries just do sensible things. And then there was a scandal because they bought, I think, 10,000 masks that weren't quite exactly right, and that was a national scandal. Whereas in Britain, of course, we are spending hundreds of millions of pounds on equipment that doesn't work, and it creates a minor scandal. And the real shock, I think, looking at Finland, for me, somebody based in England, is just how people continuously resign from their jobs as politicians when they make the smallest of mistakes. You can't imagine it in Britain. So the pandemic has been dealt with pretty well, possibly overzealously. University students are doing their lectures by Zoom in Finland, even though the country is essentially clean. And time will tell on this as to whether it's overzealous. Sorry to go on about this. The other thing which is quite funny about the pandemic in Finland, kind of stereotypically, famously, Finns are not very into small talk and chatting to each other, and also tend naturally to be 2 meters apart when they're talking to each other. So if you like, Finland was kind of naturally protected from something like this anyway. But no, it's the death rate is tiny, the number of cases is tiny, and we should expect it to carry on. However, because COVID-19 is now endemic, and even if we get a vaccine, it's probably only 30 or 50% effective. This thing will move through Finland at some point. And in a way, it's going to be an interesting question to watch, because the longer you kind of hold it back and stop the disease coming, the older people get. And the one thing you don't want to be is old when you get it. and you're going to get it.
So we're told that Finland's the most happy country on the planet, and it was for 3 years running. It's also one of the most equal societies in Europe. Now, what does that tell us about the relationship between good functioning societal performance and the levels of equality in a society?
Well, we see it not just Finland, but the other countries that score highly on this global happiness index also tend to be pretty equitable. The happiness question is quite key. It is something along the lines of, I forget exactly the wording, but it's kind of all things considered. How happy are you on a scale that goes from the happiest you can imagine yourself being to completely unhappy? So it does rely on people having a realistic idea about what is the best. Whereas if people say in Britain, imagine that the best would be if you won the lottery and you had a mansion and a yacht, and if you haven't got that, you're unhappy, then that could partly. So it's not just a kind of trite happiness question. It is, the question is quite clever. It is, being reasonable about things. What, how is your situation in life? And the Finns are not particularly extravagant, people. They're not people who kind of go out and party, and they're just consistently, and young Finns as well, not just old, consistently leveler and more happy with their lives than other people, and also Finns who don't have a university degree, Finns who don't have good school qualifications. They're less happy than Finns with a university degree, but they're happier than people in every other country of Europe with the same educational qualifications as them. And so the consistency of this is quite remarkable. People in Finland know that they've sorted things out in such a way that it might not be perfect, but it's very hard for them to find somewhere else that's doing better. And they have enough awareness of other countries to realise that to complain, really, when you have an education system and a health system and a public transport system and a housing system that they have, and you have the outcomes that can be measured, to complain, would be a bit, a bit unfair, given that everybody else in the world has far more to complain to than people in Finland have.
And it's not always been like this, has it? It's not always been an equal society. You make the point that the radical change came in the 1960s. Now, yeah. What was behind that transformation, and what were the processes at work?
Well, and it's kind of longer than that. So you have to go back, 100 years into the time of the Civil War, and incredibly unequal country. It's always interesting to ask sort of why for the extremes. What's unusual, particularly unusual about Finland? It was a colony. It was much more subordinate than the other Nordic countries. It had, if you like, less going for it. It then finds itself on the edge of the USSR in the middle of a Cold War. Mass out emigration, particularly after that Civil War, to the Americas, to Canada, just losing people not coming. No, you didn't go to Finland for decade after decade. I mean, now it has immigration, but people didn't arrive. Chance activism in the 1960s and 70s was crucial. People actually fighting for equality turns out to have been crucial. Changing the school system to make it more equal, that wasn't a foregone conclusion. But I think also realising that they had to make the best of what they had. And if they didn't make it a better country, they were going to carry on losing people, particularly the poorest would just walk out and go somewhere else. So a whole lot of things came together. Everything was right. And then when things were tricky, when there was the 90s economic recession, when Nokia looked like it was doing very badly, various points, the country was more and more robust to cope with those knocks because of the equality. And it looks in a pretty solid state now. Whenever there's any hint of inequality rising, you get commissions. And this week there was a report about a terrible rise in inequality in Finland. There is not, but that constant vigilance to be aware of what can go wrong, that's just still there. But it's hard to be completely sure. It was one of the, I have a graph that I drew, Annika hadn't seen before, just showing just how much poorer Finland had been than anywhere else in Europe as well over time. This is 200-300 years ago. And in a way, it is kind of the opposite to England. You know, a colony repeatedly invaded, controlled by Russia, controlled by Sweden, controlled, I think, by one point by Denmark, whereas England, centre of an empire that had more colonies than anywhere else had. So there's this kind of opposite background, opposite ethos. The Finns never had a stupid belief that they were somehow inherently superior to people in the rest of the world, which the elite of England have had for at least a millennia. And it really helps not to believe you're special. And the problem is, if your elite think they're special, and you can see that in England, Boris Johnson constantly talks about, you know, how he was a top cornflake, how he's more able. If people are as stupid as that and they're actually in charge, you're in trouble. And that's the problem unequal countries have. Well, Trump, you know, is a genius. He tells everybody he's a genius. You know, no political leader in Finland would tell anybody they were a genius, even if they actually were a genius. The contrasts are just staggering.
The education statistics are very impressive. Let's just list some. In 2019, it ranked first in all OECD countries in terms of education, and it's got the second biggest library users in Europe. It's the most literate country in the world. What's behind that story? Why is it so successful?
It is quite nerdy, isn't it? It's a kind of 3-generation thing now. So it is those battles in the 60s to create a comprehensive education system, but truly comprehensive, not like the comprehensive system in England, which was comprehensive but not for the 7% who go private, you know, and of course had a hierarchy of comprehensive schools, some are posher than others, and kept 163 grammar schools. You know, they did it properly in Finland. And also sensible things like realizing that all your universities have to be good. You know, you don't create a league table of universities and then damn the ones at the bottom. And, you know, because that, it not only hurts the ones at the bottom, it also makes the ones at the top, which you and I are in, smug, self-satisfied, inefficient, and a bit crappy occasionally, to put it bluntly. You know, you sit back on your laurels and say, oh, I'm at Oxford, I must be good. You know, that people in the university, I think, you don't say that because it would be a stupid thing to say. Anyway, so to come back to your question about how does Finland end up in this situation, one generation, which will in fact be my generation, get a very good, incredibly equitable education, and then their children get a kind of bonus effect of that carries on and their parents believe in it. And it becomes not unusual to speak 6 languages by the time you're 18, or 8 languages if you're a bit, you know, a bit more. And it's not unusual to be competent at maths. In fact, that isn't seen as competent, that's just seen as maths. There is quite a sort of nerdy ethos about the place, and it's interesting to actually watch what happens if you do get a good education system. And also, it isn't necessarily, I mean, everybody carries on till 18, but you don't have to go to university to have a good life. So, you know, one of the things when we were looking for what's wrong in Finland is there is incredible inequality in Finland in your chances of going to university. The middle class really do go. The working class are much less likely to go. In that way, there isn't social mobility, but working class jobs pay really, really well. Middle class jobs do not pay much more. So I think people are free to choose. Whereas, say in England, which again, we didn't do the contrast, or the USA, if you're from a well-off family, you have to go to university, whether you want to learn or not. And if you're from a very well-off family, you have to go to Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. So Princeton, Harvard, and Yale are full of people who aren't interested in learning at all, but their parents are posh and they're rich. Now, in Finland, what you get, the universities are full of people who want to learn, and if you don't want to learn and you want to make stuff or fix things, you make stuff and fix things. And again, it's this contrast. And then the learning is real learning. The education is real education. It isn't simply awarding people degrees and saying how clever they are, even though they can't do very much, which is what happens in unequal countries. where people can't speak many languages, where they aren't any good at maths or physics, but we might give them a degree in maths and physics, even if they're not very good at it. And that's one of the shameful things to sort of have to admit to. Working with Finnish people, just the fact that their level of technical English and grammar is so incredibly good, it is a bit of a shock if you come from a place which is more unequal, like I do. It's a bit dispiriting sometimes. We did a whole series of interviews for this book, and even talking to people, say, working in advertising and PR in Finland, they would still be okay looking at and using data, actually okay with it, not faking, pretending they could do something and wigging their way through. Whereas in a more unequal place, it's kind of done on a hope and a prayer and confidence. And can you speak properly and slap somebody else on the back? But you can't actually open a spreadsheet and do something with it. But that doesn't matter because you've been taught to be confident. That doesn't happen in somewhere like Finland, where people very, very quickly see through bravado, and they're not impressed. And I think that may be one reason why people do learn so well, because you can't fake it. You can't just pretend to be able and do very well on that basis.
How's it doing on the climate change front? How's it being impacted by it, and what measures have they got in place?
Well, they don't say this, and maybe they don't. It might not be particularly damaged on the grounds that the winter can be a bit cold, and if the winter's a bit less cold, summer's lovely. Summer's 20 degrees, it's beautiful. And if it rises to 24, that's not going to be too hot, is it? But they don't ever say that. There's worries about the melting of the land in the far north and so on. There's incredible concern. So an amazing level of concern. It's as if it's full of greens. So people are really worried about the timber industry, even though, of course, timber's renewable and they're just growing more trees. But there's a lot of dissent in Finland about how the timber industry works because the worries about the planet. There's quite a big movement about wetlands and swamps and boggy areas and wanting to keep them, even though the country's full of swamps and boggy areas. There's a commitment to carbon neutral. I should remember whether it's 2025 or 2030, but it's either 5 years or 10 years compared to our non-commitment to carbon neutral by 2050, which we're making no progress on at all. We're not even moving a fraction of the way at the moment towards that. Whereas Finland's commitment is real. There are innovations going on in Finland, the growing of protein without sunlight, so you can create meat which isn't meat. That's happening in Helsinki, leading the world in that. But it's not all. So Finland's also one of the major places in the cruise shipping industry that makes cruise ships, which are not very good for the planet. Although luckily the pandemic has hopefully will dramatically reduce the cruise ship industry. So it's not utopia. And there's lots of arguments. I think there's a nuclear power plant happening, but the population argue about whether that's a good or a bad thing, because in many ways, nuclear power, of course, is much better than gas or coal, or certainly than oil. On the other hand, it's not renewable. It does rely on uranium and so on, and it's not completely safe. But they talk about that, and whereas what do we do in Britain? Oh, well, the Chinese might build something for us in Hinkley Point, but don't worry your little heads about it. It's such a different attitude to things. But no, pretty green, particularly amongst the young. Oh, and of course, the Green Party are in government. They're one of the 5 coalition members. And like a normal European country, they have a big, strong Green Party. Whereas, of course, in England, I'll try not to comment about England, should we? We have 1 MP. But that's doing better than America, which, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a single member of the Senate or Congress who's a Green. It's just, Just staggering are the differences.
And you're very, very clear about being balanced in this book. You say that Finland's not a utopia, and you talk about the gambling problems that it's got and the rising populism and racism that's occurred even. What other problems does the country have?
I think that the biggest problem is the populism and the rising racism. It has a big far-right party. Now, of course, being Finland, it's far-right, or a little bit more cuddly and less offensive than the far-right elsewhere. If you look at their policies, some of them could be called socialist. But it's bigoted, it's frightened, it's male, it's old. Finland's only recently had immigration of any significant numbers. It needs it because, on average, people only have 1.3 children per couple. So without it, Finland's going to disappear. And very recently had immigration of people who are not white, particularly from Somalia. So learning how to mix is new for many Finns, particularly old Finns. And it wouldn't be impossible in the next 10 years for something to occur, some event, some violence and bombing or something, and suddenly the Free Finns have some majority or can form a majority in Parliament with some Conservative parties, and it'll be an enormous shock to Finland. That could easily happen. There's no guarantee that won't. Then other issues, the gambling has been kind of partly controlled in that it's now at least been nationalised, so it's state controlled, and I think they stop overseas gambling firms like ones based in Britain from exploiting Finnish people or trying to do that. But addiction is a problem. The addiction to alcohol has been reduced dramatically, so the problems with the alcohol that there was in the past has been reduced. Suicide rates have also dropped dramatically. Finland was famous in the past, and more equal countries were in general. Japan, for higher suicide rates, those have gone down dramatically. So a lot of the things that were problems associated with Finland are less so. There is a worry about the mental health of young people, despite the fact it's better than the mental health of young people almost everywhere else in Europe. But a worry, because we don't know, a worry about what happens when you expect so much from a generation. When you do so well, and will this cause a problem? But all the time, I mean, if you look at the number of references in the back of Finntopia that we have, which are enormous, number of references to every fact, the Finnish, despite the fact that Finland is so much smaller than other countries, the Finnish media are constantly asking questions about, is anything going wrong here? And that partly helps us get a list of what isn't perfect in Finland, but it's also how Finland manages to deal with things that aren't going well is by being constantly concerned about them, whereas other countries might say, oh, well, that's just life. So what if 1 in 3 children are living in poverty?
And we've spoken about the happiness index at the beginning, but it's also the case that Finland doesn't have a high GDP compared to other Nordic countries and others in Europe. Do you think that shows the inadequacy of a GDP metric?
I think it's really interesting because it shows you can achieve an enormous amount without having to become one of the richest, which is really, really good news. So if it was Norway, which was actually always beating Finland, then you'd have a kind of residual worry. Is it the oil? Norway's GDP is higher because of the oil. And, actually, is it harder to share things out more fairly if you have a little bit less? But Finland shows it's entirely possible. In fact, it might even be, as I sort of hinted earlier, the fact that because Finland doesn't have a wealth of riches, people have to get on with each other and share things out. You can't just fob the pot, pull off with some trickle down. You've actually got to do decent things, which is, I mean, the most obvious one Finland does better than anywhere else is flexible work hours. The number of people who can choose when they go to work and when they leave work is higher in Finland than anywhere else, including for the poorest people. and hence you don't see restaurants stay open that late at night because people don't want to work that late at night. It's the basic decency of how you deal with each other. GDP and GDP per capita really shows very little relationship within affluent countries with happiness. You don't want to be in a country with very low GDP, that's poverty. But once you've got yourself over £15,000 a year to £20,000 a year per person, getting higher GDP tends to be associated with more inequality in some cases, and even the people who've got most of the money aren't particularly happy. So yes, sorry for a long rambling answer. It does appear to be the case that Finland is showing us a way in which we can be happier, at least in Europe, without having to get much wealthier, which is really good news because the share of GDP in the world that Europe has is shrinking and will shrink. It's simply inevitable.
I've got two more for you. One of them's on sort of democracy and facts that political scientists may be interested in. So Finn's got it's got the highest trust in other people in Europe, the highest trust in news media. They've got high faith in institutions. Now, what are they getting right in that respect, and why is that the case? How does that compare to Britain as well?
Well, we're at the bottom of the trust in the news media league table, and Finland's at the top. Trust in general reduces with greater inequality. There's a lovely international question, which is, if you're on a train, would you leave your bag with a stranger when you go to the toilet? And in places like the USA and England, a high portion of people say they wouldn't. In somewhere like Finland, people say they would. And the interesting is it is almost 99.9% sure that your bag is absolutely fine with a stranger. So this isn't that you would actually be silly to do this in England. But we don't know that. We're fearful. And so we say we won't. So it's a mixture of the reality being that crimes are lower, people are more decent to each other in Finland, and also people are clever enough and able to work out that other people are mostly decent to them. But the one thing that's slightly odd about Finland, or I can't work out, is given all of that, why isn't turnout in elections a little bit higher? But we have a graph of turnout, and it did rise in the most recent pair of elections, and it's pretty high. But in general, turnout tends to be higher. Politics does better in more equal countries. Finland might be a danger of maybe slightly laid back over. There are about 30%, 35% of people still choosing not to vote. And you'd have thought with 5 political parties in power, with an enormous range of politicians you can choose from, including some of the best politicians in Europe, why don't another 1 in 10 people go and vote? And what is that about? But maybe they trust their fellow citizens to vote well for them and don't feel the need to go and do it.
And finally, this will just be one to sum up. What can policymakers in the UK learn from Finland? Is it possible to export the Finnish model here?
It would take 2 or 3 generations to export it here. The people who are most interested, of course, are the Scots, and they're endlessly looking at Scandinavian, Nordic countries and saying we could be like them. And Scotland could be, but it would just be, their grandchildren would get that. It wouldn't be immediate. But what we could certainly do is we should be looking at other European countries. We should never be looking at America. There's no point in doing that at all. It's just stupid. It's like you wouldn't look at Chile or Brazil to see how to do something. It's the same, we shouldn't be looking at the USA. They're bad at doing things. We should be looking at countries nearer to us that do it well. And I'm just amazed watching politics in this country, where people endlessly come up with ideas about something. So even COVID and the number of cases and what we should be doing, and come up with a suggestion, as if the United Kingdom was a country on Venus with no other countries around it and nothing we could learn from anywhere else. And the arrogance of policymaking in Britain, there's the assumption that the French, the Germans, people in the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, let alone Finland, have anything to tell us, is truly stunning. Whereas what Finland did, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, people went out to other countries, and they were in the United States when the civil rights movement was underway, and they were in Britain in the hippie years of the 60s, and they took the messages home from the USA and the UK and actually implemented what activists wanted and failed to get in what are now the most unequal countries of the world. And Finland doesn't sit there smugly saying, look at us, aren't we great? It's constantly watching its rankings in things and how it compares to other countries and what other countries do. We have quite a lot in the book about gay rights and Finland being slightly behind by a few years behind rights about marriage and other things. There's this constant "what are we getting wrong?" question that Finns have and are questioning. And I suspect anybody from Finland probably won't, but if they're watching this, will be really annoyed to hear me say how wonderful it is, because they could come up with 20 things I haven't said about what's absolutely terrible and needs to be better. And it's because of that that Finland stays good and gets better. Whereas in a more unequal country like the USA, well, we're just great, aren't we? Or if we're not great, let's just make America great again by saying make America great again, not by learning from anybody, because we don't need to learn from anybody because we're Americans and God meant us to be the best people on the planet, and fundamentally this is the difference. And because Finns are quite modest, really, before we needed to write a book about Finland called Finntopia, because it takes somebody from outside of Finland to say, look how good this really is, because there's a degree of being humble and a degree of partly being wary and a bit scared about losing it, and I can understand why people in Finland might think that, but given that they've achieved so much, homelessness off the streets, the lowest infant mortality rate the world has ever known, the lowest ever, less than 100 babies dying in a year. You got to go, at what point do you actually say, okay, stop, look here, something really unusual is happening, it really is worth having a look at this, because it does appear to be working better than anything else anywhere has ever done, which is why we call it Finntopia, almost, heading towards utopia.